People have asked me through the years, what does it mean to be a pastor? Well, today this is Ministers Appreciation Month, or this month of October in across America. Somebody came up with that many years ago. I really don't know who, but whatever. And so on one Sunday in October, most churches or many churches will stop and recognize their pastoral leadership in their church. And this church has done that. Brother David mentioned that you're going to do it next Sunday, which will be our 33rd anniversary of our first Sunday as pastor at Bethel Church in Duncan, Oklahoma. 33 years ago last Sunday, I preached my first message here. Not here, but in the old church at 15th and Maple. We preached my tryout message that morning, and then that night I preached again, and we got in the car and headed back across the Red River to Texas, not knowing exactly what the future was going to look like. But the very next day and the next evening, the church voted to call us to be their pastor. And I'll never forget that phone call from Glenn Brown. He was one of our deacons, and he said, Brother Meador, he said, the church voted to call you as our pastor. So it was almost a unanimous vote. I said, well, praise God, Brother Brown. We're honored that the church would have that confidence in us, knowing us so little that they've known us for the last week. And that was on a Monday night, and that's probably one of the most miserable weeks I've ever lived in my whole life. My wife was not all that thrilled about it at that moment because I didn't have enough sense to talk to her. I really didn't. I was foolish. I was ignorant. And still am to some degree because I still don't talk to her enough. I didn't tell her what was going on in my prayers and in my personal moments of devotion and meditation and the heart that I felt. I had sensed for months that our time in Stamford, Texas was drawing to a close. I had watched and noticed certain things taking place in my life that I couldn't understand fully until it was all said and done. Then I looked back and saw it clearly. But I began to lose my desire for certain things. I had a radio program that I'd had for 5 years. Every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, the Word of Life program came over our Stamford channel there, local AM channel, for 30 minutes. And I cut that program every week for 5 years. The last several months we were there, though, I noticed I just dreaded getting that program ready. Going over to my office and taping that program and spending that time and talking to an invisible audience out there. And I had some past programs that I thought were pretty good, so I began to rerun some of those. So we have relief, and I didn't feel bad about it. I thought, I don't want to do this anymore, and I didn't understand that. Finally, it came to that point just before we came up here that I was telling Jan about it, and I said, I don't know what to do. She said, well, stop it. I said, well, you can't stop a ministry once you started one. You don't just quit. And I didn't understand that. And so anyway, I did. I signed off the next week as our last program, and I didn't understand exactly what was going on. Nobody else did, but we came back home that week and spent days in fasting and prayer trying to sort through our feelings and figure out what God was doing. I was excited and scared at the same time, was anticipating what might happen and fearing what could happen, and you know all that stuff. You've passed through that probably if you've ever changed jobs or locations or anything like that. On the next Sunday, I stood up before our church. We had pastored for 7 years, and I preached my resignation and my farewell message all in one message. I didn't go back that night. We packed up the U-Haul truck the following Monday and Tuesday, and on Wednesday morning we headed north up Highway 277. I look back on those days. I have to be honest with you this morning because this is part of my message today. What does it mean to be a pastor? I owe the church in Stamford, Texas today, and I wish I had done this a long, long time ago. Most of them are not even there anymore that I knew. But I owe them a tremendous apology because I left them hanging out, just walked away in a week, in a day. I was only thinking about me. I didn't want to go through the grief of saying goodbye, hugging necks and crying and all that stuff. And I thought, we'll just call it like it is. This is it. We're going. We're done. And I watched that church after we left there for years struggle because I didn't train people. I didn't spend the time with them, preparing them for what was coming after we left, because they looked to us as Pastor Jan, and they loved us dearly, and I loved them. We spent times in their homes. We built tremendous friendships and relationships with the people there. And I look back over that, and I wish I had done that differently. I wish I had had more sense in those days to have said goodbye properly and told them how much we loved them, and they would always be dear to our hearts. And they have been all these years. I've been back and preached several funerals and have attended some, and every time it brings back tremendous memories of years ago. And I just felt like I needed to say that to you because I didn't do it right. I did poorly. Didn't do the church right. Well, we headed north, came to Oklahoma, crossed the Red River, and moved into the house that we're living in right now over at 803 Harville. We rented it in those days. We bought it 2 years later, but I'll never forget unpacking those boxes. My wife was a home interior displayer. She was a representative of home interiors and gifts, and Jan was very successful in what she did, because if you ever went to one of her shows, man, she just pulled out all the stops, and she'd have so much stuff out there you couldn't leave without buying something. She was a tremendous salesman, still is. But we had all our stuff packed in home interior boxes, and they were big boxes. And so, man, some of them were heavy. And I'll never forget, David Cantwell asked us, said, Sister Meador, how much home interior do you have? She said, Brother David, that's not home interior. That's stuff. That's clothes. That's towels. This is whatever. But they unpacked that truck, and we moved in. And we were excited to be here. But, boy, that first year or two was challenging. There was a lot of stuff going on in the spirit realm and in the natural realm that were difficult for us to work through. And God was merciful, and He helped us through all that. And so as I look back on those days, I had planned to do this on the Pastor Appreciation Day, which this is normally what it would be. But I'm going to go ahead and share what I feel I ought to talk to you about this morning. I want to tell you what it means to be a pastor of a church like this. Today, or next week, you'll honor us in some way, and you have for years and years. We've been here 13 years in 1996, and we came up that morning to Pastor Appreciation Day, and Gerald Morris, he brought in a set of golf clubs and gave it to my wife. She said, Gerald, I don't play golf. She says, you do now. And it was kind of an unusual service that morning, and they said, well, come out. We want to show y'all something out in the foyer. If we walked out in the foyer, and one of our deacons, Clyde Shepard, worked at the Ford House, and he comes driving around the church in a brand new Mercury. And I said, wow, that's cool. He said, that's yours. I said, you're kidding me. Church gave us a brand new car that year. 13 years. 20 years have passed since then. That doesn't seem possible, does it? We've had so many great memories. One time, Pastor Appreciation, the board got together and they decided that Jan had gone over to Gerald and Sue Morris's. We'd been over there for something, I don't know. We used to go to their house a lot, especially when they lived out in the country. They had people out when they were younger and they could do stuff. They're not here today. They're all on vacation, praise God. Anyway, Sue got a player piano, one of those kind that you put a scroll in and it plays itself. And my wife just loved that thing. We go see them, and Janice sat down there. We wouldn't even see her. She'd be in there playing that piano for hours, just doing it one after the other. Well, Gerald decided they're going to get us a piano, so the church bought us a player piano for Christmas, for Pastor Appreciation that year, and gave me a golf cart. I've still got that golf cart. That's been, nearly 20 years ago. And I look back over those times, and other things have gone. You've just been so benevolent, so unselfish with us. As I began to contemplate this church and what it means to me and what it has meant to me for more than half of my life, I wish everybody in America, I wish every pastor would have the opportunity to pastor a church like this. You have no idea what you have meant to us through the years. You have no idea. There's no words to describe our feelings, our emotions, our love for you. No way could we ever repay you for all you've done for us. And we have felt that genuinely through the years, and I still feel it to this day. And but I know there's going to be young men and older too today who are going to stand up in their pulpit like this, and they're going to bring the bread of life to their church. They're going to give everything they've got to a message to their church. And not one person will mention anything about, Pastor, we appreciate you. We love you. We thank God for sending you to us. This is not one church. This is many churches across this nation. Because I know men who have served in those churches, and I know men who are serving in those churches, and I want to wrap my arms around them and say, God, please let their reward in heaven be greater than anything I will ever know, and that they will be blessed for their service to God, regardless of whether they received anything in this life or not. They were doing it for you. But my heart goes out to those guys who pastor these little churches scattered all over Oklahoma and Texas and every place else, who are giving it all they've got, some bivocational, working full time, trying to pastor a church and support their family. I know what that's like. I had to do that once. It's very hard. So I just want you to remember that you are in a part of a great church, and I've never forgotten that. I've never one time ever questioned that about this church. From the very first day we drove into town, you have treated us with royalty, with like royalty. You have treated us with respect. I saw how the church talked about Brother Tucker, JR. He's still alive. He's up in his years, up in the 80s. Brother Tucker pastored Bethel 13 years. And I remember when we came, it had a little downturn after Brother Tucker came with Brother Allen. He just didn't fit here, and he left, and we came in place of him. But I remember when we moved into Duncan, I heard Brother T this, and they all called him Brother T, or many of them did. Brother T, Brother Tucker, Pastor Tucker, whatever. I heard him talk about JR and Betty and all the stuff they did together. And the old enemy came up and said, boy, they really liked that guy, didn't they? They really liked him. And I got thinking about that one day sitting in my office. And I said, you know, God, if they love Brother Tucker that much still after he's been gone for like 3 years, they love him still this way. If I love them the way he loved them, one of these days they may love me that way. And I never said one word against Brother and Sister Tucker. I always admonished them, always loved them, still do, always honored them, because they did this church a tremendous service through those years. All our pastors have through the many years and decades. I just want to let you know how much Jan and I love you guys, how much we appreciate you so much. About 3 or 4 things I want to say to you. I will try to be as brief as I can. Number one, I just want you to know that pastors are called of God to serve. We're called. I don't know of a genuine pastor anywhere that's in this thing because it's a good vocation. When only 1 in 20 men who start in the ministry at 20 years old will retire in the ministry, that is not a good vocation. 5% make it through the whole time. 5%. You say, that's unbelievable. It's true. There's not a trade, there's not a class of people in the world that has a greater fallout rate than it in the ministry. And I want to tell you something. If you're not called of God, you'll never make it. You'd never make it. But even when you are called of God, you got to tie a knot in the end of the rope many times. Just hang on to your calling, because that's all that's going to keep you there, is to know that God called me. And one of these days, he's going to get me through whatever I'm going through. And he will. But it takes a lot of courage, and it takes some patience and some waiting on God, because times are hard sometimes. We're called of God. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul writes these words in the 4th chapter, in the 11th verse. He said, it was God, it was he, Christ, who gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, to prepare God's people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, who become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. It was God who called us here. You voted for us many years ago, and you have since then, several times, but it was God who called us here in the first place, and I think He gave you a witness of that. If there's one thing I've had to know for sure throughout the years of serving God, it's that I've always been absolutely, totally at peace and at comfort with the knowing that I've been called of God to be a pastor. Even from 17 years old, when I first felt God calling me to preach, I knew I was going to be a pastor. I didn't have a desire to be a youth pastor. I didn't have a desire to be a worship leader. I didn't have a desire to be an evangelist. I didn't have a desire to be a missionary, for that matter. I wanted to be a pastor. I knew I could only see myself preaching to a church, believing that God had called me to pastor a church. And I've done that for now 44 years, and I'm very grateful to God for it. The greatest place in all the world as a man of God or a pastor of a church is to know that you're in the will of God. And the will of God is not necessarily a place. It's a path that you're walking with God, because the will can change and the path can change. But the obedience to follow the call of God, the obedience to follow Jesus regardless of what happens, that's the greatest place in all the world to be. And I have comfort to know that today. Secondly, all pastors are not the same. We're all different. A lot of people say, well, I want a pastor like you. Well, there's not anymore. Thank God. There's some good ones out there. There's guys that can lead better than I can, preach better than I can, do a lot of things better than I can. I know there are, because I've seen them. I know many of them. But God has called us here. He's given us a special set of gifts for this time, for you. And we're doing our best to use those according to God's plan and to do our best to apply ourselves to that. But every pastor is different. None of us are the same. You have to be yourself. I've tried to imitate Tommy Barnett by having illustrated sermons, and I was so uncomfortable with that, because I could never give an altar call like Tommy Barnett. Tommy Barnett could give an altar call to a bunch of dogs and they'd get saved. Man, the guy is unbelievable. You can't not come to the altar and get saved if Tommy Barnett's giving the invitation. I've seen this man do that. It's amazing. And I've watched other guys. You know, I've got my heroes of faith throughout the years. I've watched Marvin Gorman, who's a tremendous man of God. One of the greatest gifted preachers I ever met in my life. One of the most anointed men that flowed in the Spirit of God like I've seen no one hardly in my life do. He would just look at a crowd and the Spirit of God would start moving, and he'd just start calling people out and say, sisters back here in the beige shirt and the black coat, the glasses on, if you'd stand up, God will heal you of rheumatoid arthritis. He'd call the name of the disease and the people, and they'd stand up and God would heal them. I've seen that happen. I've watched God work miracles, and I tried to imitate that. Not that I would make up anything, but I've tried to, okay, God, tell me who's sick. Tell me, and that's not me. It's not my gift. I'm not gifted in that area. Once in a great while, God will give me insight into what's going on, but my gifts are more common than that. I'm not an uncommon person. Somebody has called me a redneck from Texas. That's about all I've ever been. I'm not politically correct, and I don't screen all my words, and sometimes I sure wish I had shut up and said something different before it's over. And thank God there's an editing machine in our church that we can kind of cut out some of the, you know. But anyway, you know, we're all different. And I guess I've looked back over the years, the second chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul said, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I came to you in weakness and in fear and with much trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith would not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power. I have always prayed that my ministry would be like that of Paul. I've always asked God to let me live the message and demonstrate it with the presence of God. So through the years, I will tell you, many of people have testified of this through the last many, many years. They'd come into our church from somewhere, maybe visiting or moved to Duncan or whatever, and they'd come to Bethel. And I would watch people, and I would see them begin to weep and begin to cry. And many times newcomers would just cry out and just start praising the Lord and lift their hands. And it came to be apparent that after many, many different witnesses of this and many different testimonies of this that came about, that people would come up to me and say, there is a presence of God in this church that we don't feel wherever we go. Not that he's not everywhere, but we don't sense the presence of God in every church like this. We just feel God when we come here. We start singing, and the Spirit of God starts speaking, and nobody's done anything to make you do anything. It's God's presence, and we've coveted that. We have sought that. We have asked God for him to show up every time we get together, because if Jesus doesn't come, we haven't done anything right. He makes the difference, not me. It's not the preacher. It's not the music. It's just the presence of God that makes this church unique. That's why I wish every church could be like this, that everybody would have the chance to be in a church like this. You as a member, you know how blessed you are to be around people like this in this building who love God and love each other. And they truly, I really believe 99.9% really try to serve God with all their heart. They're not fake. They're not pretenders. They're not hypocrites. We all make mistakes, yes, but there's a genuineness about this church that you just have to appreciate. I do. I appreciate it. It just means everything to me. It's a blessing to everyone who has ever been here. And then thirdly, I will tell you that pastors are not perfect. It's funny how that people expect preachers' kids to act different than deacons' kids. You know, you've heard that. It's kind of a joke, but it's really not a joke, because when it gets right down to it, people expect more of a preacher's kid than they do anybody else. They expect Jameson to act different than any of the other kids in the nursery. Well, he's not. He's a kid. He's 2 years old. He's not going to act any different. He's a little boy. And he's full of life. He's got his own personality. David, I don't know who David is. JD, I call him all kinds of names back there. He's got his pet names. I won't tell him what they are, JD. David's not one of them. That's a new one, David. JD and Michaela will have to work out their own way of raising Jameson. And other people say, well, look at Jameson. Well, so what? Every child is different. And pastors' kids are no different than anybody else's. If you ever was in a church that, they say, well, look at them preachers' kids. Look at all them. Well, they're kids. And when they get to be teenagers, they're just teenagers. They have their ups and downs. They have their ego problems. They have their self-identity problems. They all kind of, plus the pressure of knowing that everybody's expecting me to perform like my father. And they don't. And we told our son that when he was very young. I don't expect you to be like me. I don't expect you to act like me. I don't expect you to do what I do. You find God's will in your life, and I'll be happy with it, whatever it is. I never one time encouraged him to go into the ministry. Not once. As a matter of fact, I even tried to discourage him. Because I'll tell you this. When all the emotion is gone, God's called me to preach, it settles down to just a hammering out every day of carrying a burden that you do not know how to fully describe. You can't really describe the burden that God places on a minister of the gospel for the church. You carry it with you everywhere you go. And I didn't know that I wanted my son to carry that, because it's sometimes very difficult. When there's nothing you can do to change it or move it or say it's going to go away, it doesn't go away. The burden for caring about people and loving people and nurturing them and knowing that some of them are not going to make it just breaks your heart. The care of the church. Anyway, we all make mistakes. I've made so many, it's not even funny. I mentioned one of my mistakes earlier. I left the church in Stanford, Texas horribly. I didn't love those people like I should in the last few days. I didn't tell them what was going on. I didn't sit down and counsel with them. I didn't try to talk to them. I didn't try to explain anything. I just got up and resigned and left. How rude. How silly. How foolish. I was wrong. I didn't know any better. I should have known better, but I didn't. I made terrible mistakes through the years. Not morally, but you make bad decisions. I mean, thank God he's kept me pure. I give praise to God for that. I've never stolen church money that I can remember, ever. I've never done anything that I would say, boy, I'm sure glad nobody caught me there. No, my record is clean, but I've made some horrible judgment calls. And I won't go back and retrace all of them. There's times I've been blindsided and I've been taken, up, hit upside the head and not know what was coming. And you think, well, I should have seen that. Well, you can't see everything. But the whole point is, the other day I was praying and praying about this. And the Lord brought to my attention a verse of Scripture in Exodus chapter 34. And it said, verse 6, this is God passing in front of Moses as he wants to see the glory of the Lord. He said, and he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. And I stopped and I saw that slow to anger. And the modern day interpretation of that is tolerance. God just tolerates us being ignorant, being foolish, making mistakes. He tolerates. He doesn't have to, but he does. And you go all the way to 1 Peter chapter 3, and it says, when the tolerance or the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared to save souls. But only 8 were saved as a result of his long-suffering. So not everybody listened to Noah's preaching. They ignored it for the most part. And I look back over that, and I realize that all through the years, God has been so tolerant of me, tolerant of you. You've been tolerant of me. I mean, I used to live with my hair on fire. I don't have much hair anymore. I got some, but not a lot. I used to think it's never enough. We got to do something new. And I was starting something all the time. And good night. I don't know how people's put up with that through the years of all these years. And so in the last few years, I've changed. I've changed a lot. But I'm reminded of the kindness of God, the quality of being warm-hearted and humane and gentle and sympathetic. God is so kind to us. His tolerance is his good tolerance that delays reinforcing or enforcing his rights or claims or privileges, knowing that we've made mistakes, but he gives us patience and room. And as I look back over that, is my prayer to God is that I have been faithful to him. And this is what I talk about making mistakes. We've all made tons of them. Pastors do. So please, before you throw rocks at a preacher, you need to put yourself in the context of where he's coming from or she's coming from. You have to understand the circumstances and the situation that they're in order for you to fully appreciate what they did or didn't do. And it's not easy to stand in front of people every week and to maintain a certain level of excellence in everybody's eye, because you can't please everybody, ever. I was listening to Nick Saban, who coaches the Alabama Crimson Tide football team, and he was talking to an interviewer the other day, and he was expressing to them how hard it is for his ball team to maintain the level of excellence that the Alabama football team has. For years, they've been in the top 4, and they won national championships several times in the last few years, and they're number 1 right now. And he says, nobody knows what kind of pressure it puts the coaching staff on or the players to think that every time we go out there, we're going to win. That we can't even lose a game, let alone not win championships or win the SEC. But he says, they expect us never to lose a game. Well, I got to tell you something. Somewhere down the road, we all strike out and we go sit down. Sometimes we don't play well. Sometimes we make bad mistakes. Sometimes we make foolish choices. Sometimes we preach very poorly. That I'm wondering, why don't I just shut up and stop? These people are bored to death with this message, and so am I, so let's stop it. I've done that. I've been there. I hope you're not that way right now. You may be, and I'll stop. I'm about done. But Paul lists a bunch of stuff he went through in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, and he makes this as a disclaimer. He said, as fellow workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. Please don't take for granted what God is doing for you here in this church. In the time of my favor, he said, I heard you, and in the day of salvation I helped you. I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. So I will say this to everyone here today. Please don't take for granted the opportunities you have to press into God. Don't take for granted it's always going to be like this, because no one knows what the future looks like. Nobody. We don't have any idea We got a forecast, we got a hope so maybe, but nobody knows what the day will bring forth. So don't use and don't waste your opportunities. Use them to the glory of God and to your best advantage to know Jesus better. And he says, it's our desire. This is his desire. He said, we put no stumbling block in anyone's path so that our ministry will not be discredited. I think that's probably one of the most truthful statements that any pastor could ever make, is that God, please help me not to cause people to stumble, because if I do that, then the whole work of God's ministry will be discredited. Rather, he says, as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way. And he talks about all the stuff that he's gone through for the church and for Jesus Christ. And he concludes in verse 11, we have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and openly and opened wide our hearts to you. So Paul said, I haven't held anything back. I've given you everything I got, so this is the way it is. So I hope you will use this as a time of God's refreshing. And then I want to close with these maxims that I came up with. I was praying the other day, and I began to just meditate and think. I was sitting right over here, and I just got a pad out and began to jot down some things that just seemed to be impressed upon my heart. And I want to close with these thoughts this morning as we close the service, and I hope that you have been tolerant with me as God is to allow me to share these thoughts with you, because it means a lot to me to be a pastor, and you needed to know that, how honorable it is to serve in this place, how honored I feel to be a part of God's work and ministry here. Number one, I have learned that ambition and achievement may take you to where you want to go, but it may not lead you to where you need to be. You can have all the success in the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's where you need to be, because success can ruin you and power corrupts. So God has a plan. He has a time for everything. And I think one of the most important things is leaders and ministers, whoever we are, whatever profession you're in, success is not necessarily what you're seeking after. You're wanting to please God. And you may have ambitions and zeal and desire. And I used to just go over this thing over and over. Oh, Lord, let me reach my maximum potential. And I had all these dreams and ideas of this and that. But God brought me back to square one a few years ago. And he helped me to realize that before honor is humility. Before honor is humility. When you think you've gotten there and when you think you've arrived, guess what? Nobody cares. I don't care. We will weep with a person who is broken, but we have a hard time rejoicing with those who are successful. Do you know that? We can weep with the best of them. We'll cry out with you, but don't let you get anything I don't have, because I really can't rejoice with that, because there's a carnality in every one of us of covetousness. They don't deserve that, but I do. And I don't mean that to be hateful, but I'm telling you it's the truth. Preachers are no exception. Some of the worst things you can do in a pastor's meeting is have somebody brag about their church. Because you may be going through no telling what in your church, and it just grieves you, and you think, well, God, what has he got that I don't have? I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's really hard for us to die out to ourselves and continue to remember that. So achievement may take you to where you want to go, but it may not always lead you to where you need to be. Secondly, only when a person has been truly broken does he understand what it truly means to trust in God with all your heart. I learned that a few years ago. I thought I was broken, but I wasn't until 2010. And when our church went through its debacle that we had to face and go through, many of you sat right there in those pews week after week and cried and wept with me. And I didn't understand what a broken heart felt like until that day. And for months and months later, I didn't understand how we were going to get through it. I could look around. I couldn't see anything but death and discouragement and defeat. Everywhere I looked, there was nothing but death. And I said, God, have I killed this church being its leader? Have I brought this horror upon this body of people? At 58 years old, I didn't realize things would come that late in life. I thought, man, maybe I've been through all the dumb things I've done, but somewhere down the road, we missed the mark somewhere. And perhaps it was the prayer we had prayed earlier, and I remembered that earlier. God, shake this church to its foundation and bring us to a place we need to be. Please don't ask God for that if you don't want him to do something drastic. Because he may shake things you don't want shook. And man, when the fallout was through doing, I thought there was nothing left on the tree. It looked like this place was a ghost town. Almost half the congregation had left. And I look back over those years and I see how faithful God was to bring us through that. And until I had been down that road, I never understood what other men of God have faced in their life. I never knew. I had never experienced the depths of sadness that I experienced during those years. And it was not until January of 2013 that God healed my heart. He healed my heart. I mean, He healed me. I didn't forget the lessons. I didn't forget the pain, but He healed my heart. And I'm healed today by the grace of God. But I didn't know what it felt like until I had been there. And you don't either. Until you have suffered through something that is absolutely undescribable, you don't know what other people have experienced. And God allows us to go through those times in order to bring us into His presence and reveal Himself to us in a new way. And He did. And I'm grateful to this day for God's grace and revelation. Quickly, let me move on. Success is not calculated in material things, numbers, or accomplishments, but simply in being faithful and obedient to God's will in your life. That's success. Because the numbers and the things and all that stuff, that will not add up. You see, in the world's view, Jesus was a failure. Because He went from the crowds to the nothing. When He died on the cross, not one person stood by Him except John, who stood at a distance with his mother and watched Jesus die on the cross. All the sheep scattered. And you look at that from a realistic standpoint, and for all practical purposes, Jesus Christ was a total failure. So if you think you failed, look at Him. You haven't lost everything. You haven't lost your last friend. You haven't lost all the resources you've had. And yet He could have gotten it back in a moment if He'd have spoken, but He willingly subjected Himself to all that for our sake so that we would understand and He would know, as God, being a human, what it felt like to be totally forsaken by others. He knew. First words Jesus ever spoke to people were this: "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest." So God's called us to come. And the second words He speaks to us is follow me. And that's the obedience of God. You first have to come to Jesus, and then you have to follow Jesus. And it's not a one-time deal. It's a continual daily thing. You follow Jesus your whole life. Number 4, when it's all said and done, this is probably the hardest part for me to tell you. When it's all said and done, all the pieces to the game go back in the box. And someone else comes to sit in my seat. Hardest part of life is realizing that we are all expendable and we're all replaceable. I heard this years ago, and I will just tell you this. It's true. Don't ever believe your press releases. Don't read what people say about you, because you're not that good and you're not that bad. Don't believe it. Just know who you are. Commit it to God and let it go. But we're all expendable. I had a problem with this years ago. I had this messianic complex. I felt like that I'm God's little man. I'm Jesus in the world, almost Jesus Jr. I thought I was supposed to be able to counsel and supposed to be able to console, supposed to be able to comfort, supposed to be able to cast out demons and do this and preach revivals and crusades. And Lord, I was running myself crazy and I was nuts. And finally I realized I'm not gifted for some of this stuff. I can't do that. I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't go to me if I needed counseling. I'm the poorest counselor in the world. All I can do is tell you what you ought to do. Go to Chastity. She'll counsel you. She'll sit there for hours and say, "Oh, I understand." I don't understand. I'm sorry, I don't. I'm not gifted like this girl. She loves it. I said, "You love your job?" "I love my job." I said, "Oh, thank you, Jesus." I don't want that job. You got to understand, that's not my gift. I used to go home and want to slit my wrist because I was so depressed listening to everybody's woes and problems. I thought, "Oh, God," I took it home with me. And my wife says, "What's wrong with you?" I said, "I don't know, but I'm so sad." She said, "Ron, you're killing me." And I finally just said, hey, enough of this is enough, man. I'm done. Don't come to me for counseling. I mean, I'll counsel you, don't get me wrong, but I'm not a therapeutic person that'll sit on your couch with you and pat you on the back of the hand and say, I understand, just tell me more. I'm thinking, oh, no. It's 30 minutes are up. You got to understand, that's me. I mean, don't take yourself too seriously. I got to that place. I realized, hey, I worked it all out. I know who I want to preach my funeral. You say, you do? Yeah, I do. I have confidence in some people. I have ideas of what I want to see God do in my life, but I also have worked out my mortality knowing I'm not going to live forever. And every time I have a severe pain somewhere, I think, oh, God, is this it? You know? Because you don't know. It can happen so quick. You don't know. I don't sit around worrying about it, but I got to tell you, it does bother me to think that one day I'm going to get up and I'm not going to bed. Because I know it's happening, and it will to all of us. So I've kind of come to grips with that, and it scares me a little bit. Not death doesn't scare me because I know I'm going to be with Jesus, but the process. I don't want to go through the process. That's what scares me. I don't know what I'm going to have to feel or do before I get there. I mean, just, Jesus, take me quick. Let me go to sleep and wake up in heaven. That would be my desire. Of course, scare my wife to death, then they'd have two of us to bury, you know. No, I'm serious, but it's just one of those things. So don't take yourself too serious. When it's all said and done, all the pieces go back in a box. Here's my final thoughts to you this morning. People are our business. As pastors, people are our business. I'm not in the church business. I'm not a CEO of Bethel Church. I'm not the chief financial officer. I'm not the chief honcho. I'm not the big kahuna. I'm not the boss. People are my business. And I will tell you this, the greatest treasures that I have in this world are definitely not in the bank or not in possessions. They're in the hearts of the people that I have been able to know and love through the years. That's the greatest treasure that I have, is you. And through the many years that we've been here, God has blessed us with countless relationships that we still enjoy to this day and will continue to enjoy, hopefully, for a long time. But I just got to tell you, these are the things that mean something to me as your pastor. And so when all that's done, I just want to thank God for the opportunity to give you what I had on my heart this morning. And I'm sorry I messed your pastor appreciation deal up, David, but I don't know what I'm going to preach next week. I don't have a clue. We'll figure it out. Me and God will figure it out. You're in a blessed church. This is a great group of people. And if you don't have relationships here and you don't build them, it's your own fault. You're missing some of the greatest opportunities to build friendships and relationships that you'll ever know. We're all different. There's people here that are so different than me. It's just unreal, but I still love them. But relationships are the most wonderful thing that God gives us a chance to build while we're living. And to me, I count that a tremendous privilege to pastor this church for all these years. God's good, isn't he? Or at least he has been to me. I don't know if he has been to you. Maybe you're in the tribulation with me, but God's been good to me. If he's punishing you, then pray for Jesus to come. But I love being here and thank God for your faithfulness to this morning. Would you stand with me, please?